I think it's safe to say the modern metagame is kind of settled in itself. The energy decks are at the top, the combo decks can beat the energy decks, and we have the Eldrazi decks that are kind of in the middle. That also means that there is room for experimentation now. We kind of know what the decks want to do, so there are ways to fill the cracks and take advantage in maybe some linear strategies. And one of my favorite Sunday evening activities to do is just go over the modern challenges on Magic Online and just kind of peruse what the interesting decks are. And one deck really stood out. It's a deck that I used to actually play. As a mill player, I was also a bit of a graveyard connoisseur. I was a dredge player at some point, but I was able to take some of the cards from that list and the mana base itself into the Hollow One decks. And it's kind of interesting to see this deck make a comeback in some ways in Modern to be playable at this moment. And I think it's a bit of a sign of the time. So what I want to do in this video is kind of walk through the Hollow One strategy and maybe use that as a vehicle to maybe discuss where the modern metagame is right now and maybe how you can use this knowledge to exploit it to your means. If you want to see more breakdowns like this, then leave a comment down below if there's maybe a deck list that you want to see me kind of talk about. If it's one I have some experience with, I will go at it, but Hollow One specifically, again, struck a chord because it's one that I have a fair amount of experience with in my old LGS stomping or non-stomping days. Well, let's hop right into the namesake card itself. Now, the namesake of the deck is 5 cost for an artifact creature golem that says Hollow One costs 2 less to cast for each card you've cycled or discarded this turn, and it's got flavorfully so cycling 2. Now this is from Hour of Devastation, a kind of set and a block that had a lot of like cycling elements to it, in the sense of kind of losing a card and being able to use it for value after the fact. Like it was kind of like lore specific to like the reanimation of zombies and whatnot at the time, but there's a lot of value in a card like this, and I think a lot of players caught onto that really quickly. There's cards like Street Rate that you can cycle for free that immediately reduce the cost of this by 2. So it's not 6. If you cycle 2 Street Rates and pay 1, then you're going to be able to play this as well. So there's a couple of lines that you can take advantage of here to really cheat out a bunch of these. And the goal of modern Hollow One is to cheat out as many of these as early as possible and just present an overwhelming board, noting that, of course, this has no evasion, there's no flying, menace, or anything like that. But it really just says, can you deal with a bunch of free 4/4s or anything that synergizes with it after the fact? And that's kind of where Modern is going. It's about using the odds at your advantage to present an overwhelming threat or just get swept over. But I'm going to walk through why you have to play the odds. It's the closest thing you're going to get to gambling in Modern at this point. But with the Street Rate synergy mentioned, we can start to see how we're filling our graveyard as well, because Street Rate also has its synergies these days in just also being graveyard fodder. Back then we had the delve mechanic as well to take advantage of these things going into the yard, but even in the modern day we have ways to take advantage of its converted mana cost as a way to alternatively cast things out of our yard. But we don't want to jump too far ahead in that sense. This was the old modern Hollow One. This took 4th place at Pro Tour Rivals of Ixalan, and this deck has so much going on. It really is, to me, this might sound like boomer magic, so let me know in the comment section down below if you agree. This was honestly the crown jewel of Modern to me, right? Like, yo, it had it had Faithless Looting, it had the Lightning Bolts. This is when Tassiger the Golden Fang was a good card in Modern. Oh baby, this was a time in Modern. I mean, just look at the sideboard cards. Behind my camera we got Fatal Pushes. When was Ancient Grudge in your sideboard? Grim Lavamancer was the grind option of choice. Now y'all get the One Ring for free in your main deck. We got Big Game Hunter, Blood Moon, and the classic of Leyline of the Void. Y'all don't understand what we had to do to hate out graveyards before Endurance. Y'all don't know. Y'all Zoomer Magic players don't know what we had to do back then. But when it came to a deck list like this, there's a lot of synergies. As I was mentioning, the double discard, Faithless Looting was probably the biggest thing that you can bring up here. But again, a deck list that wants to discard a ton of cards. Burning Inquiry was 1 mana, and each player discards 3 cards and draws 3 cards. So actually, I believe it's draw, then discard 3. So there's a bit of a difference there, but The key here is that that effect is at random, and Goblin Lord is 1 red and 1, and draw 4 cards, then discard 3 cards at random. So again, this is that whole lottery system of this deck. High highs, low lows. Sometimes you Burning Inquiry and you lose all your lands. Sometimes you're Burning Inquiry and you lose all your hollow ones. Sometimes you're Burning Inquiry and you're able to drop 4 hollow ones on turn 1. It's there. Those turns are the ones of true magic. And to be fair, this was a time when cards like Path to Exile were a lot more playable. We weren't at the prismatics and the Leyline of Abundances and everything, or the, you know, the 1 mana enchantment catch-all in the 5-color domain zoo decks. It wasn't at that time. The removal was completely different. I mean, Collective Brutality was a main boardable card. I mean, also off the fact that Collective Brutality allowed you to just discard 3 cards off of 2 mana. That was powerful enough in and of itself to just enable some hollow ones for free. But there are plenty of other synergies in the Bloodghast being able to come back to be discarded. Flameblade Adept was a very good turn 1 play, having Menace and just being able to be generally brought up to like 3-4 power on turn 2 and swinging in with something like that. There's a lot of synergies here, but really this was a time of faithless looting. The modern metagame was completely different. Graveyard synergies were just on a league of its own, and this is a card that honestly at this point could probably never be unbanned. And I say this because, you know, the graveyard decks would be hyper enabled, and it would essentially mean you're either playing a graveyard deck or you're playing a deck that plays endurance to stop the graveyard decks. The graveyard decks would actually genuinely be the best decks in the format. They would be better than anything else you could do. You think the One Ring has value? You think energy is something? No, faithless looting is a defining archetype, and I envy all of y'all that don't know the true power of this card. Drawing 2 cards, discarding 2 cards, getting a hollow one down to 1 was easy enough, but this was card selection. That was the key here. This wasn't card draw, because card draw implies a sense of being positive on cards. Remember that this is 3 cards for 2, so you're playing the faithless looting, which is 1, you draw 2, which is up to 3, and then you're you know, you're kind of down 2 cards, down 2 cards from there. So you're in total down 3 cards with the faithless looting. So you're kind of discarding, you're selecting, and selection is the key in a deck that wants to throw out quote unquote high quality cards. You want to enable things like your Gurmag Anglers or your delve cards in general with Tassiger to be able to play out threats to reuse your graveyard. Nowadays we have better uses out of our graveyard. We can just cast things straight out of our yard now, but again, faithless looting was that kind of defining era. And this card wholehandedly, I mean, if I just move my camera a little bit here, this deck was single-handedly responsible. If we look at this right here, just this spike. So February of 2018, we had a bit of a spike here to a $17 average on a card that was bulk rare. $1 at most, $1, right? Shot up, and then immediately in March with multiple, you know, tournament winnings, we had the Pro Tour top 4, shot up to a $40 to $60 card in Goblin Lord. This deck single-handedly spiked this card up extremely high, and of course this was like the average. You know, there's some opportunities in the market for low, but people were all there kind of digging through their old bulk to find their Goblin Lords. And I mean, over time it's gone down. I mean, now it's kind of at like $5 to $7. It's held like market memory cost, but just really wanted to point out that this deck single-handedly took Goblin Lord to playability and spiked it up to an insane price. And it's never like truly recovered. Like, it's never again gonna be like $1 card, because yeah, like the players know that the Hollow One players can take advantage of a card like this. It's always a fun piece of the trivia in the Hollow One decks. Nowadays, or I should say with the evolution next up, was you started adding things like Venge Vine and Asmo Marca Dastana Kuldakar was something that gets added as well as part of the kind of cookbook and food package. But also really Venge Vine is the big kind of addition that I wanted to bring up, where if I kind of bring my camera back in here, Venge Vine was another way to take advantage of the graveyard and the shift of Hollow One to become more linear. And heck, even back then, the deck was very linear. It presented very high highs and low lows, where you had moments where, again, if someone could find a clip of this, because I was trying to find this, where there was a clip on coverage where, to my memory, what it was, this was clipped to insanity at the time, where a Burn player was playing against a Hollow One player, and this was on coverage. I can't remember if it was a Pro Tour or an SCG event, but the Hollow One player played Burning Inquiry and got the Burn player to discard all of their lands so they didn't have a turn 2 land drop, or maybe even a turn 1 land drop. It was insane. It was the wildest thing that happened. Of course, this was like the extreme high of what could happen at a situation like this, but it really goes to show you the funny moments that you can get. But a card like Burning Inquiry can also feed the graveyard pretty aggressively, throwing things like Venge Vine in there. And so when you start casting spells, when Hollow Ones are free and you throw some Venge Vine in there, I mean, the nuts is that you draw three Hollow Ones and you discard 3 Venge Vines. You go Hollow One, your second Hollow One kind of triggers your 3 Venge Vines. You play a third one and you're swinging in for 12 on the Venge Vines, and you got Hollow Ones on the back there. And a lot of times at that point early in the game, there's no way to remove all of that at all. Heck, even the energy package can't really do that. I don't even believe with like Wrath of Skies, right? So I mean, I guess maybe, I don't know, it's really got to push to be able to do something like that. So a lot of these nut draws, that is definitely the extreme high, can't be stopped by the average deck in Modern now. But of course, that's where the randomness of it came. This wasn't something that you could select for the cards you're discarding for. Again, I just really want to push to you before you go pick up this deck or anything. It's random. Goblin Lore makes you discard cards at random. Burning Inquiry makes you discard cards at random. But the highs of this deck was the pure magic of it. And there actually were, again, elements of consistency to it. You had the Flamewick Phoenixes that you could bring back, that, you know, the Phoenixes, if you had a creature with power 4 or greater on the battlefield, it had a ferocious trigger at the beginning of combat, then you could pay 1, return it, and you had a 2/2 haster kind of flying creature in the air. You had the Tassigers and the Gurmag Anglers that you could play, taking out cards in your graveyard. And then Venge Vine was this extra way to go super linear to force your opponent to always have the interaction, right? Like back then it was Leyline of the Void or nothing, because this deck was so powerful, it was so fast that you needed to have something on turn 1 immediately, because a lot of times like a Relic was too slow, a Nihil Spellbomb was too slow, because that also meant like, yeah, you had a turn where you could, like, you know, stop your opponent from doing something, but then it was also just a turn where you couldn't develop anything, right? And especially if your Hollow One opponent went first, you would spend that turn playing your Nihil Spellbomb or your Relic. Remember that Relic costed mana to even pop, right? So you played a Relic, yeah, you could tap something out, but then your opponent chose what they exiled off the tap. Your opponent goes to their turn 2 and they're going off. So it really was like Leyline of the Void or nothing at the time. Nowadays, Alzoomer's got endurance. It's too easy now, right? Modern Horizons 2 has really ruined deck building for a lot of you, right? Back then, we had to make real choices, but Venge Vine was the next true evolution to me. And I mean, I do want to kind of bring up the Asmo Food package in itself, because it was really synergistic with the discard element of it all. And it was another like cheap creature that you could play to enable the Venge Vine and everything. Another good way to take advantage of all that. And it added an element of like removal as well, with like the sacrificing 2 foods. I mean, dealing 6 damage, look, it killed Titans. That's a pretty good hallmark of why even a card like the Unholy Heats of the world are playable. Dealing 6 damage is a pretty good just like baseline on cards and effects like this for just removing chump blockers and everything. You also played effects like, I don't believe this deck has it. Oh no, it does. You'd play like a One of Wonder. So Wonder would give your creatures, if you control an island, it would give your creatures flying. You play like a One of Steam Vents and stuff like that to just enable, and that would be a way for you to go over top of what your deck is doing. This deck notably did play Fury, I guess, yeah, out of the sideboard, but you play Ox of Agonis as well, like the kind of Dredge classic, to also re-enable what's going on in your graveyard, draw more cards, and just kind of keep going through Blazing Root Wall. It had the Madness for 0, so more ways to play creatures out, enable your Venge Vines. And that it, like, once you play Venge Vine, there are a certain amount of other cards that you have to play. You're kind of playing 2 packages. You're playing, or 3. You're playing the food package with Asmo. You're playing like the Venge Vine package where you have to kind of play some free spells as well, which is why Fury was also really good in that sense. And then you're also playing the Hollow One package. But if you just went all in on the Hollow One stuff, nowadays, I don't even think the Hollow One decks would really want to be playing the One Ring. They're not, spoiler alert, because they want to be linear. They want to be faster. They want to be better than what you're doing. And Burning Inquiry is really good at doing something like that. I mean, look, let's look into a deck list that is more recent, because there's a lot of crazy synergies to come out of a deck list like this, where you have the Flameblade Adept, we have a new Phoenix, we have Orcish Bowmasters, Nether Goif as your kind of consistency piece to come out of the yard, and Hollow One, Burning Inquiry, and Goblin Lore still there. Now, this deck is notably playing like Wild Slash for some reason. I guess, like, you know, just to not, like, to stop from damage from being prevented, I guess. I mean, okay. It's also playing the Inti. Inti is like a really low-key, like, powerful card like out of like for most of the red decks here. But there's a couple of aspects to this deck that are really different now that attack this metagame, that attack this modern metagame in a very different way. Now let's start off with Orcish Bowmasters. I kind of talked through the whole hollow one thing. Yeah, you can get out a bunch of hollow ones, but again, they don't have any form of like evasion, menace, flying, anything like that. So you need other ways to deal damage. Now Orcish Bowmasters, if you're playing a black deck, you're probably playing Orcish Bowmasters. Mill is the only exception because we don't really take into account life loss for this. We don't really take into account the value that we get off of something like this. So Orcish Bowmasters is not played in a deck like that, but good in all black decks. Flash. The key to a card like this is that it works really well with Burning Inquiry, because you have to remember that Burning Inquiry forces you and your opponent to draw 3 cards and discard 3 cards, which is why I was saying like the deck has like low-key really good interaction. In a really like random way. Like if you're a gambling type, you're gonna love a deck list like this, because as I mentioned in that burn interaction, there are situations where, yeah, you can just get rid of your opponent's best cards. Like, yeah, you might draw them into more lands because they kept a 1-lander. You might draw them into more win conditions, but you could also take them away from that keepable 7 that they had. They might have kept it with, you know, the subtlety that they had, and now you make them discard it. They might have had that turn 1 Ragavan that now you make them get rid of it. But on top of the Orcish Bowmasters, forcing them to draw 3 cards is really powerful. You get 3 individual Bowmaster triggers. That's 3 damage. That's 3 amass triggers. There's a lot of value to be had out of something like an Orcish Bowmasters. Heck, if you have like 2 Orcish Bowmasters out, imagine just ripping a Burning Inquiry off the top. Yeah, you're drawing 3, discarding 3, but that's 6 damage, 6 amass triggers. Come on, the synergy is there. So that's a really powerful interaction when it comes to a deck like this. But Burning Inquiry in itself, have to remember that it is a sorcery. So you're not like reacting to something like this. This is very much a proactive card. You kind of treat it like a weird random high roll Faithless Looting. So that's always something to remember alongside the Goblin Lord. There are no instant speed shenanigans that you're taking advantage of. Orcish Bowmasters truly kind of introduces that into the deck, but the deck was very linear and proactive in that sense. You're not necessarily worried about what your opponent's doing. You do happen to do that out of the post board, because a lot of the linear strategies or the unfair strategies were very good against the Hollow One decks. But the thing is, the Hollow One decks sometimes provided this like overwhelming threat that it was just better in that sense, especially against like the non-One Ring decks. In a lot of ways, it was good at grinding, but with the Eldrazi decks out right now, Chalice on 1 is actually really powerful against a strategy like this, stopping the Burning Inquiries, stopping the Lightning Bolts, and everything similar. The last card I want to bring up is Nether Goif, a card that allows you to take advantage of the cards that you have in your yard. I mean, Hollow One just being an artifact creature is very powerful. We have the Phoenix, which is an enchantment creature as well. The Phoenix just being able to come out of the yard is very nice in a deck with Hollow One and with Street Wraith, where Phoenix allows you to bestow out of your yard for 1 red by kind of investigating 6. So exiling a bunch of cards in your yard that equal a total CMC of 6. Street Wraith and Hollow One just immediately take you up to 5, and then you can get rid of like a Lightning Bolt and you're already there. You can take out the Phoenix, give something +2/+2 in haste. But Nether Goif also really great in a sense like that, where you can exile cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. So that's a Hollow One, that's a Phoenix, you're already there. You probably don't want to get rid of the Phoenix, but it is an option for something like a Nether Goif, because then you're also like reducing the amount of types that it has. But again, a recurrable threat that's already in your yard that you don't have to enable with like a Ferocious trigger like the old Phoenixes for 1 red, or something like a Delve creature, which you again had to draw. You had to have it in your hand. So this is just a better card to have in that situation. Modern Horizons 3 power creep in your yard to take advantage of. Why not just play your own Goif? But the last card that I want to mention, that was the last creature I should say, I believe I mentioned that was the last card, but the last card I want to mention is that Surgical Extraction uniquely is powerful in a strategy like this. I've talked about in previous videos about how Surgical Extraction really only gets played well in the mill deck, specifically because you're able to proactively mill your opponent out and create that graveyard as an extension of the hand, where Surgical Extraction can then act like a super juiced up Thoughtseize effect, where now you're able to target cards in opponents' graveyards where they may not be filling their yard. They may have used a removal spell, and then like, you know, other decks are like, okay, well, I can only surgical the removal spell, I can only surgical a fetch. me as a mill player can then glimpse the unthinkable in an opponent, find a Tron land, surgical that. But Burning Inquiry and cards like that really provide that additional angle that can stop things like that. And of course, Surgical Extraction at a base level, very good against the graveyard strategies anyway. They're going to fill their graveyard. You're going to be able to kind of find the cards that you need to get, and you're kind of you're laughing all the way to the bank from there. But in a lot of ways, especially against like Living End decks, a lot of times like Living End players will keep hands with you know, kind of the Living End in hand to pitch to other cards or just have as an extra piece, because at the end of the day, like, yeah, you may not be pitching to Grief anymore, but nowadays, like, you're fine as long as you can go like land into your combo, and you're fine with keeping the Living End in your hand, because in a lot of ways, especially against the mill decks, especially against the Surgical Extraction decks, generally you don't want to add more copies into the yard for you to just like, for them to like find and then surgical. So it's like almost better in your hand, especially against the mill decks. But against the Burning Inquiry decks, it can be actually a negative in this case, where it, like, they can discard it out of their hand. It's a lower kind of higher opportunity for you to find it, put it in their Surgical Extraction and get rid of. So Surgical Extraction, I want to point out as being a uniquely actually good card in a modern deck that I find, like, again, is very different from how mill can use it, very similar, but the value is like kind of close in that sense. So again, still has a little bit of recursion out of the yard, consistency in the long game, high explosive kind of ideals in the early game, and some very unique interactions and lines of play with something like Surgical Extraction. So it kind of has the makings of a very interesting modern deck. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the thing to take away from modern Hollow One being a playable deck again, and you know, like 5-0ing for a very long time, it's not like modern Hollow One really went away, but you would play it in like maybe 1 out of every 8 to 10 leagues, whereas now you might play it in every 1 to 3 to 4 leagues, because especially with like Andrea Mangucci and Doomwake recently making videos on a deck like this, and it placing 16th and 30th in a recent modern challenge over this past weekend, Hollow One is a representation of a metagame that is very linear and wants to go over the top. It's a deck that says, can you beat my mid to best draws? And its mid to best draws puts out 1 to 2. Its best draws will put out 3 to 4 Hollow Ones onto the board, along with some Phoenixes, maybe even some Nether Goifs in the mid game, and it asks you, can you beat that? Do you have the removal for this? And in a world full of Galvanic Discharge, this thing having 4 toughness is so powerful, because a raw Galvanic Discharge will not be able to get rid of something like this. They have to have another energy generator. They need 2 spells essentially to like amass the resources to be able to deal with something like this. And naturally, having cards like Blood Moon in the sideboard, having Orcish Bowmasters in the main board, you have some natural protections against cards like the One Ring. So again, a strategy that says, I am very straightforward, I know exactly what you want to do and what I want to do, can you beat what I want to do? That's what it says. And that can be a very powerful thing in modern, because we've had metagames where it's kind of like 2 ships passing in the night, kind of like drag racing. And this feels like one of those metagames where if combo is at the top, that's essentially what you're presenting. Like, can you stop what I'm doing? Can you beat what I'm doing? Because I don't really care about what you're doing. Chances are I can get to what I'm doing, because you got to think of it like an odds game. There aren't a lot of cards in the deck that you're necessarily upset about getting rid of other than a Hollow One. You want to play the Hollow One. So throwing out a Burning Inquiry is perfectly fine. Like, yeah, you might lose a land or 2, but you might draw a Hollow One or 2. And then you have like 2, 3, heck, maybe if you got the God roll, 4 Hollow Ones on turn 1, and your opponent just cannot beat that. Like, I would be hard pressed to think of a modern deck that can actually get past like 4 Hollow Ones on turn 1, unless like you're on the draw, you're up against like Ruby Storm, like, yeah, sure, maybe Ruby Storm can go off on turn 2. There's lines for that, and more consistently they can go off on turn 3 once they get a reducer out. Generally speaking, decks can't beat something like this, which is why it was good back then. It was good with the Asmo Venge Vine packages, and Hollow One is good right now. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you think Hollow One has legs in modern right now? Do you think it's a bigger symptom of what's going on in modern in general, with the linear aspect of the metagame, where you have the aggro decks that have the One Ring and can interact in that way? You have the Tron decks that are essentially like these weird like land destruction mid-range ramp packages that just go into big Eldrazi, while like actually like relatively like being prison decks and interactive like ish in the beginning, with again destroying your lands and playing out chalices. And then you have the combo decks that are trying to beat all of that or circumvent some of that. Like the modern metagame is actually like really crazy, really different from where it's been pre-Modern Horizons 3. New decks, new strategies, and new ways to win the game have come up to the top, and I'm really excited to see decks like Hollow One kind of come back and be a symptom of what is going on with where we're shaking things out post Modern Horizons 3. But again, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Let me know what deck you've been playing to some amount of success in the current Modern Horizons 3 metagame. I'm really enjoying Mill right now. Like, yeah, like I may not be 5-0ing, but you know, consistently 3-2ing and 4-1ing, like if you're winning the majority of your games, that's a good place to be. And I'm really liking where everything is landing out in a post Modern Horizons 3 modern.